Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you. Thank you so much, Martin Toft, for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, to speak about, I know it first started off as your blog post in regards to the knowledge of these family company that had started a fishing company that traded in terms of with codfish to the Caribbean. And now it has grown into your own research project where you're making about, I think it's 8 different books of it so far. But before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Sure, yes. And likewise, thank you so much for inviting me to your podcast. I'm now going to listen to lots of different podcasts you've already done because there's a vast wealth of material there. Yeah, so my name is Martin Toft, and I'm a visual artist really, and also work professionally in education. But I've been, using photography and moving images for the last 30 plus years, try to interpret, subjects which interest me. Sorry, and they're mainly to do with sort of things from the past, sort of ancestral history, indigenous cultures. I also seem to have an interest in people who are sort of on the marginalized areas of, let's say, documentation or histories. Although, I'm born in Denmark, so I don't come from a similar sort of background. Come from a pretty ordinary middle class Danish family, really. But currently I live in the island of Jersey, where I've been living in the last 20 years. And before that, I used to live in England, London, and I also used to live in Australia and New Zealand. So that's my background.
Perfect. No, and that's what we're going to be focusing on, is just this trade between Jersey, or the connection between Jersey and the Caribbean. Now, can you just kind of give us I guess, a visual or a geographical kind of location where Jersey is, and how does it fit into this whole broader Atlantic world?
Okay. So for those who don't know, the island of Jersey is part of a larger Channel Island archipelago, which consists of 5 islands, and Jersey is the largest. And it's located in what's called the Bay of Saint Malo in the English channels. So we are closer to France, about an hour's boat ride from France, and then about 5 hours boat rides from the south coast of England. And historically, we are linked with the Duchy of Normandy, which is in northern France. And about up until 1204, the duchy was then lost to France by the English crown under the reign of King John. And in return for Jersey maintaining their allegiance with the English king, he granted the Channel Islands sort of self-governance. So since that time, Jersey is classified as what's called a British Crown dependency, which is not dissimilar, let's say, to sort of other colonial outposts that you see in the Caribbean, but it has a different constitutional relationship. But essentially, Jersey has its own autonomy, so it can write its own laws. It has an elected government. It prints its own money, which is all linked to the British pounds, if you like. And like the Caribbean, it also has a crown representative in the island, which is a lieutenant governor who sort of represents the current king. And they have no sort of power anymore, but in the past they did. Now it's more sort of a ceremonial figure. So that's where Jersey is. So in size wise, it's very small. It's 9 by 5 miles, so for about 45 square miles in total.
No, thank you for that, because many people don't really immediately think or associate Jersey with Caribbean history. What made Jersey such an important maritime and trading hub?
Well, of course, being an island, the Jersey has always been dependent on the sea for for its establishing an economy and trading with, and through the maritime trade, has established links with other nations. So, in the sort of in the medieval period, most of that sort of maritime trade was with England and France. But then from the 16th century onwards, as ships were being built who could sort of sail across the oceans. So Jersey then got involved in the North Atlantic fisheries in Newfoundland very early on. Some of the earliest records we have of Jersey ships sailing to Newfoundland is about 1540. At that time, of course, there were other fishermen up there. Some of the earliest ones from Portuguese and Basque and French. But essentially, for the last, well, for during, let's say mid 16th century to the late 19th century, earlier 20th century, for a period of about 400 years, Jersey was involved in, international shipping.
Mhm.
Sending, ships would sail from Jersey all over the world. In relation to the Caribbean specifically, the big connection there is that most of the mariners from Jersey were involved in the cod fisheries. So that meant they were setting up seasonal fishing stations in the sort of Atlantic Canada, and that includes Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Quebec, New Brunswick, all around the Gulf of St. Lawrence, really. And one of the main markets for selling their cod fish was the Caribbean islands. And that's where that sort of historical trade began.
Yeah. And so I guess, was this that prompted you to look deeper into Jersey's role in Caribbean trade, especially given that much of the historiography has not critically been examined to its ties to slavery and plantation economies?
Yes, I mean, the island of Jersey is a relatively wealthy island right now. If you look it up, it probably ranks in the top 20 nations in terms of GDP. It
Mhm.
doesn't mean that everybody who lives here is wealthy, but essentially, my entry into this sort of history of Jersey's connection to the Caribbean began while I was working on another large project to do with Jersey's sort of finance sector. We have a mono industry that dominates, which is the offshore financial sector, and that's where the majority of the wealth is generated now. So I was looking into what were the original wealth before the finance sector emerged. And so some of the earliest banks we had in the island from late 1700s were merchants' banks. And I realized that those merchants had made their fortunes in the cod fisheries. And so that's where the entry for me then began, into looking into, what, how the Jersey people got involved with the fisheries. Where would their ships go with the codfish itself? What would they exchange the codfish for in the islands where they were sailing to and other places? And that's, then I began to sort of research the larger, what we call the triangular
Yeah.
transatlantic trade network, if you like.
No, no, absolutely. And then, of course, your research highlights one particular family which was deeply tied to the fishing trade that linked the British North Atlantic to the Caribbean. Can you tell us more about that family and how that system worked?
Yes, so the project that I've developed called Entrepôt is mainly focused around this one individual called Charles Robin. And he came from a sort of very prominent Jersey family. For example, his grandfather was a seigneur, which is a sort of French Normandy title, which meant he was a large landowner. He was a jurat, he was a lieutenant bailiff, which is the sort of the second highest position in the judiciary. And other members of his family were already merchants involved in, they had a fisheries up in Newfoundland, his uncles, for example. So Charles himself, his parents died when he was fairly young man. So he had a person who became like his guardian, and who was also involved in shipping. So him and his brother, when they were sort of maturing in age, they wanted to be involved in the family firm. So they proposed around 1763, at a time when the British had won the 7-Year War with France, and the French territories in British North America, sorry, in North America became British. They then realized there was an opportunity there to establish a fishing station, let's say, in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So they persuaded the family members and other shareholders to go there to sort of make exploratory voyages up to the Gulf to see if they could establish these sort of trade post. And that's where the sort of the beginning of what was to become Charles Robban and Company started. But there were other iterations of that sort of company before it became Charles's own. But he was not a. I mean, these fishing companies were never owned by a single individual. They were bit like you have now. There were investors and financiers and shareholders, because you did need a fair amount of capital to set up a shipping firm, building ships, employing people, and then, bringing cargo from one part of the world to another. It did require some sophistication.
And how did, something like cod fishing in places like the Gaspé connect directly to Caribbean plantation economies?
Well, I mean, Charles Robban was just one of many Jersey firms in the British North America. I mean, there were also other Jersey merchants, for example, in the United States when they became independent. They were based in New England, mainly Boston and Salem. So he was just one amongst many, but he became very successful because he sort of was the first one to go to the Gaspé region. There were other merchants when he arrived there in 1766, but very soon, he sort of established a monopoly. And all those merchants from the Channel Islands, including our sister island Guernsey, who were also involved in the fisheries, they all, were all mainly based around the court. So that meant, they set up sort of seasonal fishing stations, or what's called inshore fisheries, which meant that they would hire local fishermen to catch the fish. They were then sort of setting up, warehouses and processing plants on the shores, and they then produce different types of grades of the cod fish. And that's important to understand, that different markets require different grades of cod fish. So, for example, Charles Robban, he produced mainly two different grades, but there were variations within those two categories. The first one was his premium quality, which was, a dry cured cod fish, which was sort of took a lot longer to produce that fish, because it had to be cleaned and gutted on the shore, and you had to employ very specialized workers who could do that type of job, and the fish was then dry cured for 10 Sundays on the shingles up there. And that's why that area was very good for that type of processing, because they had good wind and there were reasonable good weather in the summer so you could then get on with doing that. That type of cod fish was known as yellow, because the fish itself sort of acquired an amber colored flesh because of the drying in the sun. And that fish was not sold to the Caribbean. That was a sort of premium product that was sold to markets mainly in Europe, Mediterranean, all the Catholic countries, Spain, Italy, and Portugal, and then later on in Brazil. So the other type of cod they produce, which Charles Robban himself referred to as West India fish, was a sort of cheaper version, which was not dry cured. It was a wet fish, which meant that as soon as it was caught in fishing boats, the fishermen would then salt it and put it in tubs, and that meant that the fish didn't have as long as a shell life as a dried cod fish. So it meant that you had to sort of bring it to market fairly quickly. The advantage was that because it was a much quicker fish to process, you could often make two voyages, from the Gaspé to the Caribbean with this sort of with that wet fish. And they used to call it the green fishery, because the cod fish itself didn't go yellow because it wasn't dry cured. It had a sort of green color. Anyway, so that was the sort of fish that he then manufactured for the Caribbean market, but all the others did the same. Mainly that fish that was sent to the Caribbean was spoiled fish. So that meant it was either fish that wasn't good enough to make the sort of premium cure, or wouldn't be the right size or the right thickness, or it had been damaged in some way. So it was a lower quality fish. But nevertheless, there was a huge market for it because of the plantation system in the Caribbean. And we know from the literature that's been written about Caribbean history or staple theories or commodity economies that cheap codfish was sold at local markets to planters who then fed the enslaved population a diet of dried cod or salted cod, sorry, as a sort of protein-rich food source to increase the productivity in the fields and plantations. But I have to say there's a small caveat there because, from my research in the Caribbean, this is one of the reasons why I went there, because I wanted to look into the more, the sort of the details of what did a slave diet actually consist of in the Caribbean. And so when I started looking at that in more detail, it's far more nuanced and complex than just saying that cheap cod was sold to, to the enslaved populations in Caribbean.
No, absolutely. It's definitely very layered. And, beyond this family, were there other Jersey families you traced who had similar ties between the North Atlantic fishing industry and Caribbean trade networks?
I mean, there are other I mean, there are many others I could have looked at, but I just focused mainly on the Charles Robban and Company, because the whole project that I have established called Entrepôt is sort of based around the network that he put together. But you could, and also the reason why he's very good to use as a sort of central figure is that most of his business records are kept in various archives in North America, and he was very meticulous. He was very meticulous in keeping a record of everything that happened within his company. That's why most of the books that is sort of published around the Gaspé fisheries tend to use him. But all the publication that's been made so far, the historiography so far, has never really looked at let's say, the market, what I call the entrepôt, the trading post or the outpost where his fish would be, sold or exchanged for other sort of cargo or produce. So that was my main focus. But there will be many other Jersey merchants or British merchants and Americans, of course. We know, if you look at the sort of broader statistics and data, that selling salt cod to the Caribbean was a major industry that generated enormous wealth for the ship owners and merchants in North America. And of course, it had a huge impact, I feel, on the not only on the identity of the Caribbean people and its culture, but also its geography and its economy. And certainly from the sort of Jersey perspective, one of the reasons why I was interested in working on this project is that people in Jersey are like, as I spoke, in the Caribbean, they're generally aware that people in Jersey made money from the core fisheries, but they're not aware of all the details. And that's the stuff that sort of puzzled me and sort of annoyed me, that they sort of just celebrated the fact that people from Jersey would be so brave to set up fisheries up in Canada and then, send ships across the world with codfish, but I didn't sort of realize the impact that this had on, ordinary people and communities in these marketplaces where the ships would go to.
Exactly. And, you did mention, cross-referencing ship registers and publications like Chronique de Jersey.
Yeah.
How does this kind of data allow us to map voyage patterns and better understand the trade routes?
Yes, I mean in the island of Jersey we have very good archives really, and they've been preserved really well. So in the mid 19th century, Jersey had 14 newspapers. That's just shows you
Wow.
how sort of prosperous it was. So those 14 newspapers. Now we only have one, and at that time French was the official language. So you had French newspapers and you had English speaking newspapers. It was the sort of the influx of English expats that changed the culture in Jersey from being a French Norman sort of let's say dialect, and then sort of became a lot more British. And so most of the newspapers, in particular, like Chronique, they would have shipping news, what they call Nouvelle Mer, and there we could see, where ships would come from, where they would go to. And so if you use that as a starting point, make notes of, okay, ships, that name of that ship, and you will also list the master of the ship or the sea captain. Then you can sort of look at other records, like we have something called the Jersey Merchant Seamen's Benefit Society, which was a sort of a pension fund, if you like, for seamen who at sea would pay in sixpence every month, I think it was, or every year, I can't remember now, but just in case that, if something happened to them, if they disappeared or drowned or died, the widows or family would get sort of a payout every year to sustain life. And in those records, you can see each seaman, you can see crews, you can learn about what ships, the crews on each ship, the size of the ship. But there's many other type of records that you can use as well to sort of cross-reference, what ships went where, who was on the boat, what type of cargo it carried. But it's not an easy task because you have to sort of cross-reference several documents, and in a lot of cases, these documents are not in the same place. So, for example, something called the ship's manifest or custom records, those you have to go and look at in each place where the ships would sail to
Mhm.
see what exists there. In the Caribbean, on my trip there in 2024, I looked for all these records in the archives I visited in the five islands, and nothing was kept really. I was quite surprised by the fact that there was no shipping records on ships, foreign ships entering, and what was the name of the ship or what cargo it carried or anything like that. Because what we spoke about before, some of these archives has been decimated from natural disasters, fires, etc. And also in some cases, the records has been taken from them and then kept in the National Archives in the UK, in London, and not shared, with the local archives in the Caribbean where they're most needed. So you have to be sort of creative, and it takes some time. It does take some time to find your way through all this. And I'm not even sure now, after 10 years, that I'm not an expert on it still, but I know where to go to find records if need to.
Mhm. No, absolutely. It's that, I guess, that investigative hat that you wear to try to find and get to the information that you're looking for. Now, by 1830s and 1840s, what do the numbers tell us about how Jersey's level of involvement in Caribbean trade?
Well, that data there that I've used, that has been compiled by other historians who wrote a book about 30 years ago called The People of the Sea. Because that historian, he went to the Kew Gardens. You have to go to the National Archives to sort of look at, because there you can find the records, but it is a painstaking work. So
Mhm.
using the data that he produced, his name was Jameson, A.G. Jameson. We can see that, I mean, it's relatively small. So I'm just sort of looking at the numbers now, that In 1830, he did a sort of a trawl across the data set, and in that year, only 14 vessels from Jersey traded with the Caribbean. So I would say that's relatively small because, you know, Jersey at that time was a very large ship owner and also becoming a very important shipbuilding um, sort of place. In fact, in the mid 19th century, it was the fourth largest shipbuilder in Northern Europe. So I would say that that represents a relatively small number. And then in 1840, 10 years later, the number had increased to 22 vessels. So it's still, but it represented an even smaller number in terms of the overall shipping to other places in the world. So I would say that, compared to where Jersey merchants were operating, it was a relatively minor enterprise but you also have to look at that in broader context at that time. As you know, the emancipation of slavery in 1834 in the British Caribbean islands, that meant that that this certainly had an impact on, let's say, the demand, if you like, for caught fish. But of course, by that time, cod fish had entered let's say, the sort of food culture and identity of the Caribbean people. So that meant that it wasn't just enslaved people who would eat cod. The slave masters, free folk, other types of, categories. As you know, there's different sort of categories of the population that we don't have elsewhere because it was a colony. Also, of course, would eat cod fish. So by that time, the need for the cod fish or the taste of cod fish would have expanded.
Yeah, definitely. And we're just going to go back to, your key figure in your work, the Charles Robin and Company. Who was Charles Robin, and why is he so central to understanding this trade?
Well, I mean, as I alluded to earlier, he came from a family of merchants, and there were also store owners, and his family was part of the Jersey elite. So that meant he would have been given a good education. I don't actually know. We don't know very much about his younger years,
Mm-hmm.
but he would have certainly have been probably
Yes.
sent to a school in the UK. Some of the most prominent Jersey families would send their children to sort of English boarding schools. That still happens today, in fact.
Yes.
So he would have come from a good family where there was opportunities for him to, to certainly become a business owner, and this is what he did. But as an individual, again, we know very little about him because all he seemed to be doing was just work. I mean, his business records and letter writing is incredible,
Mm.
and he spent 31 years living in Gaspé himself, and this is and both during the winter time, and that was
Mm-hmm.
probably one of the reasons why he became the most dominant merchant there, because unlike all the other merchants who would only spend time there in the summer months, he stayed overnight over winter, which is incredibly harsh. In certainly those years, where the housing stock was just made from timber shells.
Mm-hmm.
So it was certainly an advantage for him to do that. But we know very little about his sort of social life. I have his diary. He did write a diary early on from 1767 till about 1787. There are some gaps in that, where we can get an insight to the people he meet, some sort of social events. He was trilingual, which meant that he was fluent in French and he was fluent
Mm-hmm.
in English. At that time in Jersey had their own sort of dialect of the Norman French language, which is called Jerier, or Jersey French, if you like. It still exists today, but it's a language which is in peril
Mm-hmm.
because it was mainly spoken by the people in the countryside. So that meant he was trilingual, which did mean that he could communicate with the local French population, as well as the English sort of professional classes. and then also converse with his own people in a language that nobody else understood. And he had seemed to have very good relations with the indigenous groups there as well. In the Gaspé, there was a group of indigenous people called the Mi'kmaq people, and he traded with them. We have records of him trading with all sorts of people, from Acadians to Mi'kmaq to Americans to so obviously he was good at establishing, sort of professional relationship, and he used agents all around the world. In the parts of the world where he was interested in, and sometimes if he could, he would always try to use agents that was linked to him or families that he knew. So, for example, in the Naples, he had family members stationed there, and also in Lisbon, and later in Liverpool, his nephew John was agents there. But most of the time, he was using agents that were either Jersey connected, or certainly connected through contacts that he had made with people in Britain. So the relationship between Jersey and Britain is very important in our understanding of how Jersey became, or played a small part, if you like,
Yes.
in this sort of triangular trade with the Caribbean and so forth.
No, thank you so much for that. And, would you be able to walk us through, I guess, a typical voyage might have worked, from dried cod leaving the Gaspé region to plantation goods returning back from the Caribbean?
Okay, sure, yeah. So a ship would be, loaded with fish in Paspebiac was his headquarter, but he had fishing stations all over the Gulf.
Mm,
At one time, there was about, yeah, I mean, he had fishing stations in Labrador, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, which is where Gaspé was
yes.
part of that. So, but all that fish would then sort of be shipped on smaller boats to his headquarters in Paspebiac, which still exists today as a museum. And then ships would be then sent, with various grades of fish. They might have other. I mean, he did trade in other products too, but the codfish was his main sort of product, and there was the codfish that sort of determined everything. But he did also trade sometimes with salmon that he bought from some of the indigenous groups of Mi'kmaq. But he also had cod liver oil, so he might have had some of that with him later, as a cargo on the ships too. But they would then essentially sail from there, maybe stop en route in Halifax or
Mm,
Boston or Salem,
mm,
to offload some of the codfish there, or pick up other merchandise there to take on the route that depended on various things. But essentially, he will sail to the Caribbean first, and the main sort of 5 islands that he tend to use, and that's the data that I have extracted from his letters that he sent to his captains and agents around the network. The main one he used was in the order of sort of preference was Dominica.
mhm,
That's where most of his ships would go, and then Barbados, Grenada, Martinique, which was French, and then Saint Lucia. But I do have records or evidence that his ships would also go to other islands like Trinidad, sometimes Cuba, Jamaica as well, but it was sort of infrequent.
yes.
And so they would stop there, offload the cheap version of his cod that he called West India fish. That fish was wet, so that meant it didn't last very long. So you had to make sure that that was sold fairly quickly before it got spoiled. And then he would pick up, Caribbean plantation produce, which was predominantly sugar, rum, and molasses. Then his ship would then sail across the Atlantic. And by that time, depending on, early on, his ships would go to the Iberian coast in northern Spain. So that
Mm,
would be Bilbao, San Sebastian. Santander or Vigo, which is further along the coast. That was before the mid to late 18th century. After the early 19th century, he sort of began to establish, networks with Brazil and then also Italy in particular, and Sicily. Sicily and Italy was two different countries at that time, and so then the trade networks would then change. But essentially, his ships would sort of follow that, I would say, traditional triangular route where you
Mm-hmm.
leave Canada with produce, you go to market in the Caribbean, and then you sail on further down either to the Mediterranean, and then the ships from there would always go to Liverpool, where he had
Mm-hmm.
his nephew as an agent because he liked to use the UK ports because there were advantages with that in
Yes.
terms of tax.
Yes.
And then he would then sail from Liverpool to Jersey before that same ship would then make the return voyage across the Atlantic back to the Canada. And so I mean, he owned many ships. I mean, I don't know exactly. He had at different times, sort of the different times he had, in terms of the number of ships he owned, but he would always have a fairly large fleet of ships which would sort of go, along the sort of triangular route
Mm-hmm.
continuously. Whenever the market was good. So that's the sort of
Mm-hmm.
voyage pattern that he would follow.
Oh no, thank you, because that's almost like reverse or kind of upside down if you kind of visualize it in terms of how that particular trade route would go. Now, you as well mentioned in your research how certain, I guess, Jersey residents connected directly to plantation ownership. How did you uncover all of this information?
Well, I mean, my main reasons for going to the Caribbean in 2024 was to look into Charles Robin's business connections there. But of course, I couldn't stop. I couldn't help myself looking at. I knew that there were about 39 individuals in the island of Jersey who received compensation in
Mm-hmm.
1834 from the UK compensation scheme. So I'd already made a note of that. So I thought, well, if I'm going to the Caribbean, while I'm there, I want to find out more about, who these individuals were, what they owned, what were the sort of, what were their footprint, if you like, in the Caribbean. So most of them were not actually Jersey residents. Most of them were, in fact, all of them were what we call British expats. So that meant they were British people who were not born, not native Jersey, if you like. They had come to the island of Jersey, after at some point, to essentially establish themselves because Jersey is a sort of tax haven, if you like. We're not allowed to use
Mm-hmm.
that word now, but
Yes.
there's still a tax haven to this day, whereby if you live here, you have certain tax advantages, and that was the same, in the 18th and 19th century, and that's why Jersey suddenly had like a big influx of British sort of expat community, which was military officers, people from kind of colonial sort of background. Anyway, so one of those people in the register was linked to a photograph that I was aware of
Mm-hmm.
in the photographic archive that we have in the island. And the photographer who had made that particular picture in Jersey, a guy called William Brodie, someone that I had studied previously in relation to another project. So I was always been interested in images that emerged that he had produced. So there was a photo. He had made a photograph of three people sitting around a sort of dining table.
Mm-hmm.
And in this table, you have a guy called Michael Jackson,
Mm-hmm.
and around him were sort of two servants, which appeared to have a color of a sort of black complexion. So we don't know who these people were, but we sort of assumed that there might have been, what we call servants of Michael Jackson. So when I was in St. Lucia, I looked up one of the estates that is listed in the slave compensation database that UCL put together. This is called Soufrière.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a town in St. Lucia called Soufrière, and that's where the estate was. So when I went there as part of my research and driving around the island, I wanted to look up, okay, is that estate still exists, and it still exists in the landscape, and it sort of turned into a sort of tourist style estate where people can come and well, they can't come and see what it looked like as a sort of
Mm-hmm.
sugar estate because it was a distillery, but there is a restaurant there and there's a sort of steam bath there, and anyway, then there's a garden, sort of botanical garden. So I knew about that stuff, but so I wanted to find out more about that estate. So I looked that up in St. Lucia's archive, and it had some information, and that was
Mm-hmm.
interesting. So I realized it was owned by a family called Duboulet. So when I was in Soufrière, I drove to the estate, and by sort of coincidence, I met a guy in a car park, and that's how often things happen for me.
Yes.
I met a guy in a car park, and he happened to work for the current Duboulet, a name called Andre, and so he called upon him, and he came, and I spoke with him, and to my surprise, he was very open and invited me in and was happy to talk to me about his family history. And then I was then allowed to sort of get a tour around the one of the estates that his family owned. This was not linked to the Soufrière, but it was another estate because the family owned several sugar estates in that area. And so that then sort of I made some interesting connections, or sort of interpretations of how the sort of legacy of, let's say, that estate and the person who then came to live in Jersey, because that particular person who took that photograph of Michael Jackson, who owned that estate at the time when the slave compensation was paid, he also set up a rum distillery here in Jersey. So he was a photographer, but he was also a rum distiller. So I was
Mm-hmm.
just sort of speculating about how those two people met in Jersey, you see. And
Yes.
I just wondered if it was because they both had a sort of interest in rum or liquor, or just like drinking,
Mm-hmm.
together, because it seemed to be a strange connection that someone who owned a rum distillery in St. Lucia in early 19th century then sort of ended up becoming friends with another rum distiller who happened to be in Jersey. And that's
Mm-hmm.
so I made a connection, if you like, through the location of that estate via that photograph. But
Mm-hmm.
that's the sort of um, you know, that's the sort of connections that
Yeah.
you need to be mindful of, because you
Yes.
can sometimes make a connection that does not exist.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I do like those sort of yeah, I do like those sort of what do you call those sort of links that you can make
Links.
across
Yeah.
time and place, because sometimes that can actually suddenly open up other questions and possibilities.
Yes. Absolutely. And I know that you mentioned with Charles Robin that he had some sort of familiar connection, especially when it came to England, like Liverpool, his nephew was there. Was that the same thing with the islands that he traded, like with in Dominica, St. Lucia, Barbados? Were there that type of connections as well?
No, not that I found. I think that in the Caribbean islands, he didn't seem to have, any sort of specific
Hmm.
connection to people who were either linked to the island of Jersey. But he would have. I mean, I didn't find that, and that was one of the things that I wanted to look for. I always look for wherever I go to the trading post that he would send his ships to, always trying to find what are the names of the agents that he used to facilitate, trade with his
Yeah.
codfish. And I didn't find anything in the Caribbean. the sort of so I have to sort of go back a little bit, and then the closest connection I can find are that he seemed to be using agents that was stationed in Boston and Salem and Halifax, because those three ports,
Mm-hmm.
they had a massive. I mean, they did a lot of trade with the
Yes.
Caribbean because it was close in proximity, if you like. So I think that he must have used agents there who already had good
Yes.
connections in the islands, because it's not as straightforward as it might
Mm-hmm.
sound like. But
Mm-hmm.
obviously, an agent would, a ship would arrive in the Caribbean, the cargo would be offloaded on the port or the pier, then whatever location it is, then there was lots of people involved in for the fish then to end up in a plantation. I mean, it's not that straightforward. There would be customs officers, there would be porters, there would be a wholesaler, there might be
Mm-hmm.
and then, of course, there will be a fish auction where somebody connected to a plantation, maybe the planter himself or some other intermediary, would then go and buy the fish. Then the fish would then be transported to where the plantation was, and then sort of being dished out. But I was hoping to find in the Caribbean. I was hoping to find, for example, maybe records of fish auctions, but I didn't see any of that. I was hoping to see records of ships arriving, from Charles Robin,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't see that. But I know what ships he sent there already, because, as I said to you, the records that he had kept from his side in Canada is very extensive. So I have
Mm-hmm.
I have names of ships and cargo and dates already, but not all of them, but enough. So I knew where they went and stuff and what they carried. But from there onwards, I didn't really find anything. So
Mm-hmm.
you sort of have to, I'm there to I'm there to sort of interpret
Yes.
this sort of information through a photographic discourse. So obviously what I do is I then go to, places which are linked to that sort of history. And if I can find specific locations or sites like the Sufri Estate or others, where there is a specific connection to Charles Robert and other Channel Islands or Jersey, then I use that. But sometimes that doesn't always happen. So in other words, you have to sort of make a substitute for something that happened, and that's how I sort of construct my images. So, for example, uh, in the Caribbean, I visited many, many sugar estates. I mean, I can't
Mm-hmm.
tell you how many, but a lot. And some of them, yes, because you've been there yourself. Some of them are still operating today, as distilleries, and they grow sugar cane. There's always an element, obviously, of tourism attached to it, because that's where the majority of the revenue is generated. And so you have to sort of go and then sort of make images of what the legacies of that sort of industry, looks like now. And then sometimes, because of the people you meet there who might still be connected to one of the original families, like the Dubelays, you can then actually, get access to, let's say a mill house, for example,
Mm-hmm.
where the enslaved people would grind down the sugar cane and
Yes.
boil the sugar down. I saw places like that which are linked, which were 18th century boil houses and mill houses, and in Brazil as well. I saw a lot of that, from basically tracking it down. But again, it requires a lot of effort and a lot of determination. Um, and of course, but the good thing for me in particular in the Caribbean is that I can communicate with most people, because of that sort of legacy of the British colony, English. Most people can speak English, and so I can communicate, which is, it's different when you are in places like Brazil, where
Yeah.
Portuguese is the main language.
No, absolutely. And I know that you spoke to this in terms of the challenges and or gaps in the archives. But for you, how has this impacted your research? Has it made it more difficult, or just for you to kind of look differently or look outside of the box?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, as a researcher, when you do find some primary material,
Mhm.
where that is so significant. And especially for me, I use the archive research and primary material in particular as a starting point, as a sort of creative starting point for me then to begin to think about, okay, how can I use that information or data that I have just learned, and then how can I translate that into something that is pictorial or visual?
Yeah.
That's the sort of challenge for me. So I use the same methodologies as most researchers to start with, which is, you look at the records, you make your notes, and you follow all the leads where possible. But then, what I like most is the field work, where you're out in the landscape, in the communities. And as you know, if you do that sort of field work, there is an awful lot that suddenly now everything makes sense when you are in the place, in the sort of original location where okay, in the past, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, this is what happened here. You can
Mhm.
sort of, you have to sort of you have to reimagine what
Yes.
things look like, but there's clues everywhere in the landscape, in the buildings, in the people, in the culture, in the food, and in the everywhere. It's just you just have to sort of you do you learn how to find these clues,
Yeah.
and then you have to then obviously find a way to, I mean, to photograph them, if you like, or record them
Mhm.
visually, and then of course then comes another set of considerations which are far more important, which is you as an image maker has a huge responsibility in how you're then putting these
Yes.
pieces of information together, whether that's photographs which are put together in a particular sequence, because you have a lot of power there as the
Mhm.
author, if you like, or the image maker, or the film, or the filmmaker, or whatever or the creative person. And you do have a huge responsibility to make sure that you're doing that in a way which is ethical,
Yes.
and it is also based on historical sort of
Yes.
accuracy as much as possible. But of course, this history is not an absolute.
Yeah.
And it's the same with I mean, for me, a photograph or a word or an object is the same sort of thing for me, in the sense that it's still something one has to interpret and put in context with other things. But it's when you it's where you but the skill is in making those sort of connections between archival records, photographs, whatever else it is you're using, testimonies, interviews, whatever. And then making sure that you're doing that in a way that, as I said, it represents as much as you can, because obviously I'm also on top of all that. I'm
Mhm.
very I'm very aware of my own position in this whole
Yes.
structure, where I'm a white male from Europe, middle class professional, and I'm going to another place which is a different culture. I sort of represent the colonial
Yes.
upper class, when I arrive in communities in the world, as a sort of outsider. And I'm very aware of that position. But I still believe that if you can still do that type of work, if you're doing
Mhm.
it in the right way,
Yes.
whereby you have to make sure you're collaborating where much as possible, and you have to be very honest and open about what your intentions and motivations are. But still, I also teach
Yeah.
photography and visual art. So, I teach my students about
Mhm.
representation and all, and the power structures you have between the person in front of the camera and the person behind the camera. And I do think that, I will, and it is happening anyway. There's lots of
Mhm.
people in the marginalized communities, if that's the right word, I'm not sure. But there's
Mhm.
lots of people now want to tell their own story. And essentially, that's what that's 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 probably the most probably the best way.
Yeah.
But there's I mean, there's such a complex legacy that, I still believe that there's many different voices that can come to
Hmm.
fore. But you have to be absolutely open about and well where all your information came from and how you used it and that sort of stuff. So I'm very conscious of all that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just being very mindful and just being respectful to the information, the history that you're dealing with. So that's just one of the things. And if we can just touch upon in terms of the Brazil's independence in 1822, how did that reshape trade patterns? Like, what does that transition tell us about the changing of the global trade in the 19th century?
Yes, I mean from the perspective of Charles Robin,
Yeah.
because it might be different from other merchants,
Yes.
but obviously Charles Robin was aware that I think the emancipation of slavery was on the cards. He has made references to it in his letters. So obviously the market in Brazil was opening up because of the independence in 1822. So there sort of was a shift in terms of the trade geometries. So he very early on was exploring, sending ships to Brazil. I mean, before the independence, he was already selling his fish in Brazil, but what he had to do was he had to send his ships to Lisbon or Porto, and then his
Mm.
his produce or his cod was transshipped onto Portuguese ships and then sailed across. So he had already, sort of established a network with Brazil via Portugal. So in 1822, when he became independent, he very soon began to send his ships to the state of Bahia, and also in Pernambuco, and then later on in Rio de Janeiro, but also up in Belém, which is in the state of Para, which is sort of close to the delta of the Amazon, up in the sort of Caribbean, on the Caribbean side, not the Atlantic side. Um, and so Brazil became more important to him as a market rather than the Caribbean. And I don't know be exactly why that happened, but I suspect it's to do with a number of factors, such as the market was much bigger because the number of plantations in Brazil was quite large. And because he had these good connections with Portuguese merchants and agents already, he sort of had, I think, a good knowledge of it. And then also, I think that in Brazil, he didn't sell his cheap cod fish in Brazil. It was a dry cured fish. It
Okay.
was a different grade of a fish than the one he would sell in the Mediterranean. Nevertheless, it was a dry cured fish. It was a smaller fish. So it meant that, when they were sorting out the fish up in Paspibiac or in Gas Bay, he could use some of the smaller fish and dry cure that, and then use that for the market in Brazil. And in Brazil, he gained a reputation for producing the best dry cured cod. Is actually because I've just finished nearly writing the text for the book for Brazil, and I found references to him in particular in sort of statistical books and data written by the government of Brazil in the early 19th century, and then mention him specifically. So he sort of what I mean, so that what that meant was that he commanded a high price for his produce.
Yes.
So I
Mm.
think that he was driven by market forces, like most entrepreneurs. He was driven by money and profit. So I think he probably shifted or changed the geometry from the Caribbean to Brazil because he could get a better price for his fish there. So in other words, he could earn more money. At the same time, he could pick up produce from there that the Caribbean didn't have, such as coffee
Hmm.
and tobacco,
Yeah.
which became more important than sugar.
Hmm.
And in Europe, in particular, coffee, was very sought after at that time. So I think it's different factors like that would make him change his mind. And then, as I said, the emancipation of slavery, which was sort of shaping up, in the British colonies, he probably knew that was coming. So he then thought, well, I need to find a substitute for the Caribbean or the West Indies market. So I'm not having some sort of glut, because around that time, 1820s and
Mm-hmm.
1830s and 40s, is when his company was actually the most successful.
Oh,
So that's when he was producing, a high amount of dry cured cod and sending ships, all to market, in high numbers.
mm-hmm. No, thank you so much for that. And Martin, for listeners in the Caribbean and the diaspora, what is the most important takeaway from your research?
Well, I mean, I think there are probably a number of things. One is to recognize that what the history of the Caribbean is fascinating, because is sort of it has vast networks, even to a small island like Jersey. Jersey is a small island, Caribbean island. So, there's this whole thing called island studies,
Mm-hmm.
which is a sort of academic field that I'm very interested in.
Yeah.
And we have a school of island studies here, which I was sort of on the periphery involved with. So there's that. So I think if you are a person who are interested in island studies, there's different sort of maybe interests one can explore there. And I know actually that the school that we have here are currently setting up collaborations with another island studies group in Antigua and
Mm-hmm.
Barbuda. So, and also right now in Jersey, we have people from the Caribbean coming here to work in our hospitality sector, which is a sort of strange thing where, in our sort of history of connection,
Yeah.
which at the time in Jersey people didn't really, I think about, because it was via Canada and North
Mm-hmm.
America. But now we have a sort of revived connection with Caribbean communities, because people are coming from there to work here and island studies. But so there's that. But for me, the most important thing, or the reason why I'm interested in the Caribbean, is the codfish itself. How and why that became so important for the Caribbean people and the identity and culture. And I mean, that's why I went there. I wanted to find out more about how important the fish itself was in their diet. And if I just finish on that point, um, and I learned a lot from the research there, because I
Mm-hmm.
met some incredible people, both in all the islands. And because wherever I go, I try to find the people who has the best knowledge, like experts. So, for example, in Dominica, there is a well-known historian called Lennox Honeychurch, and he's still alive. So I met him, and he's written many books about the history of Dominica, which is Dominica as an island is a sort of lesser well known. It's
Yeah,
not. No one really knows
exactly.
much about Dominica as they know about Barbados, for example,
Yes.
or Jamaica, as you know. And it actually, of all the five islands, for me, it was the most fascinating island of all of them, because it's sort of underrepresented,
Yeah.
and it's a beautiful island too. It's very underdeveloped, which that's the sort of thing I like. But of course, they themselves want to probably have a more developed island so they can bring in tourists and all that stuff. But anyway, so for the going back to the codfish, I then learned that in each individual Caribbean island, the importance of the codfish was different, in the sense that in some islands like Dominica, like Grenada, for example, like St. Lucia, like Martinique, which are sort of very mountainous, beautiful natural resources. There the enslaved populations were, well, not in every case, but in a lot of cases, were given some small gardens or unproductive land to grow their own food. So they would grow vegetables, and some of them would have livestock, chickens, and things like that. So, in other words, the cod fish was not as important in their diet as it was in Barbados, because Barbados is very flat. So that meant that the British plantation owners wanted to utilize every single inch of that land to grow sugarcane because they made a lot of money from that. And we know from recent research on one of the estates in Barbados, which is called Newton, where there's been an archaeological dig, where they have dug up, skeletons from some of the enslaved people who had died in a sort of mass grave. And they also have good records. I haven't looked at the records myself, but I know others have. The Newton estate, we know that the people there were malnourished and had a very deficient diet because essentially the food they ate was imported, whether that was dried cod or jerk beef or dried pork. In other words, they weren't given any land to grow their own food. So what I learned was there's far more sort of nuanced about how codfish, how important codfish was as part of an enslaved person's diet. And I think that if I was a Caribbean, if I was a person with Caribbean connections, I probably would want to look into that more detail because I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. And also, importing food to certain islands is also dependent on, natural disasters, for example. So we know that if there was a big hurricane, for example, that in a year, that meant that no ships would go there, which meant that the population was then didn't have the same sort of access to commodities than they would have if there was, if there was sort of internal wars. That also had an impact on importation of food and so on. So, we have, it's like all things. Once you start looking at it in detail, there's a lot more to uncover. But from Jersey itself, what I'm trying to do here in this island, because very few people in this island seems to, have knowledge of the sort of wider maritime networks, and that's what I'm then hoping to sort of fill that gap by, sort of alluding to the fact the reason why Jersey looks like it does today, because it is a wealthy nation. Some of the, the institutions that we have, like in the UK, were built on the proceeds made from slavery as a sort of whole project. And I think it's important for people to recognize where that wealth comes from and the sort of privileges that comes along with that. And I'm a product of that. As I told you, I'm a product of being born into a privileged nation. And as you know, Denmark were also a colonizer. We had three islands in the Caribbean with the same sort of plantation system as anybody else. And when I grew up in Denmark in the 70s, we were never told about that in school or anything like that. And I still don't understand, why these things, even to this day, these things are not really, they're not really discussed properly. And I work in a sixth form school over here. I teach it, and although I don't teach history or literature or that stuff, but I always teach my students about this part of Jersey's history because they need to understand why things are called certain things, why this has a name, why this building exists, you know, why they can go to school for free, get a very good education when others can't. So I do feel for myself that there is a certain responsibility that if you do have some information where about this sort of legacies or histories, I do feel you need to share it. And for me, let's finish that off. My skill is to make some photographs and then put them together, in some sort of sequence, and then and by doing so, sort of telling a story, the best way I can.
Yes. No, absolutely. And thank you so much, Martin, for coming on to the podcast and talking about this. I'll make sure to put the links for your 7 series books of the Entrepôt in the
Eight
show
series,
notes.
8.
Oh, 8. Oh, sorry, 8. So at least it's there because it's being published by Dewey Lewis Publishing. So I'll put the
Yeah,
link
well,
in there.
but it's not, I just need to say that the book is not published yet, because
Okay.
I'm still, yeah, I mean, I'm still making it. I mean, everything is done, but I'm writing the text.
Okay.
The texts are always the most difficult thing for whenever you make books. The texts are always the last thing you do.
Okay.
Even if you commission other people to write it, it's always the last thing. So the books won't come out until, well, 2027, maybe not even in 2028.
Okay.
Yeah,
But
and
I'll put
I still need to find quite a bit of money to pay for the printing of it. It's like, 50 or 60,000 pounds,
oh wow. Oh, wow.
for printing costs, which I need to find.
But I
So,
was
so I'm just saying that, it's a work in progress still.
okay. Not a problem. And I'll make sure as well that original article that I saw, I'll make sure that's in the show notes so people can be able to refer to that. But no, thank you so much for your time, for your knowledge on this, because this has been such a real interesting aspect of the trade and a different way to look at it as well, based on what was impacted. So thank you so much for your time.
No, I thank you.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.